So, um, as the wonderful hosts let you know, you can put questions or comments in the chat throughout. I'll pause a couple of times to address them. You can also use the raise hand button, and I'll be checking in periodically to see if you have any questions. I'm going to talk for just about 25, 30 minutes, and then I'm going to give you time to actually try some of these tools and put into practice the strategies that I'm talking about today. And we'll do some breakout sessions where you'll get a chance to ask questions and points of clarification. So, tonight's presentation is called Using Social Annotation to Develop Critical Close Reading Skills. Again, I am Dr. Amanda Licastro, and I'm just delighted to be here with all of you. Your hosts already did a wonderful introduction for me, but I did want to let you know that I was formerly an assistant professor of English at Stevenson University for 6 years. And then when I moved into this position, I now teach for the English department at Swarthmore College, which is a small liberal arts school in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I also help other instructors integrate digital technology into their curriculum in pedagogically sound ways. I actually have a certificate in interactive technology and pedagogy from my doctoral program, which is the Graduate Center, part of the CUNY system. And in that fellowship, I worked with faculty across the curriculum very closely to help them make their assignments more student-centered, active learning, and engaging through the use of digital technologies. My dissertation was actually on multimodal composition, so learning to integrate multimodal elements into writing assignments. So this really does follow that research trajectory that I've had. But I wanted to let you, this audience specifically, know that right when I graduated from undergrad, I actually worked in an elementary school. I did a program very similar to Teach for America called Jesuit Volunteer Corps, where I worked in an elementary school in Chicago. And it was some of the most challenging work I have ever engaged in. And I still work with K through 12 teachers through the National Council of Teachers for English and the Education Caucus of the American Studies Association. So it's always a delight for me to work with our K through 12 teachers. So why am I here to talk about annotation, you might wonder? Well, I don't like to make assumptions without data to back them up. So here's my data to back up the fact that a 2018 survey found that 97% of college faculty members believe that it is important or very important that students come to class having completed their reading. That might seem obvious to you, right? That college professors are assigning reading and that they really need their students to have completed that reading in order to be successful in the course. But there really is data to back that up, that reading is essential for success at the college level. However, statistics from the ACT indicate that only 51% of students are actually prepared to do that college level reading. This is a huge disconnect, right? We're assuming that students are coming in with these skills because they're so critically important, but all of the data we have shows that that's not actually the case. So how can we bridge this gap? How can we make sure that students have the skill set they need to succeed at the college reading level? So this is what brings me to our topic of annotation. It is one tool in our toolkit that I have found to be particularly effective at getting students to read closely and carefully with really challenging college level reading. So when I started doing research in the area of social annotation, I came across a piece by William Logan, who is a poet, and he had purchased a poetry collection online on Amazon, and it arrived on his doorstep, and he found, to his dismay, that it had been annotated, that there was writing in the margins. And he wrote, "Those who read with a pen in hand form a species nearly extinct." And I was wondering about this because I was always taught to annotate, when I was a kid learning in school. My teachers would tell me to take out a highlighter, to take out a pen, to highlight, important passages, to write notes either in the margins or on a notebook paper that I would keep with the text, and to use those annotations, those notes to keep my focus and to refer back to when it came time for an assessment. And then I realized that maybe what William Logan was saying is that there's a certain kind of annotation that we privilege in academia that we don't really define or talk about well in terms of pedagogy. And this brings me to the second part of this quote, which says, when we write or engage with readers from the past, we engage in that conversation time and distance otherwise makes impossible. And that's a different kind of approach to annotation. It's not the kind of annotation where you're writing notes for yourself as a memory aid or a study guide, but it's actually writing in a way to start a conversation or in a way that's social. It's in collaboration with other people. So this is a screenshot from my Kindle app on my phone. And it says that there are 9,940 people that have annotated this Kindle edition. Now, normally I do a quiz here, but since I can't see you all as I present, I will give you the answer to my pop quiz. But this is a screenshot from Orwell's 1984. So clearly it's capital L literature, right? We consider this a literary work. But I highly doubt all 9,940 people were assigned this book in a class, right? We have everyday people all over the world annotating their copy of 1984, and they're doing it socially. They're sharing those annotations with all the other readers of Kindle who can access this dashboard and see what other people thought were popular or interesting in this text. So unlike what the William Logan quote said, I do think that people still annotate. In fact, I think that many people are still using annotation to engage with texts. And I think it's a very popular way to engage, especially with online texts, with born digital texts like your Kindle application. We also use other digital tools to engage socially with texts like Goodreads and TikTok's book chat and X, formerly Twitter, and all of these other social media platforms, even Amazon reviews, right, of texts where we're talking about texts online and sharing our experience of reading those texts. So I wonder if maybe we could transfer the skills of pen to paper on your textbook or using social media sites to talk about books and actually transfer those digital literacy skills into the classroom to help support close reading. I agree with Jason Jones, who's written extensively on digitally annotating texts, that the notion of better understanding a text through others' experience is arguably the foundational experience of most liberal arts classrooms. I don't believe that we assign texts so that students read them in isolation, right, for personal growth. We actually assign them so that we can have peer-to-peer learning and so that we can have that text in conversation with critical literature and theory on the topic and learn from each other's perspectives. We want discussion about the text. We want to bring the text alive and have students make connections to how their reading of the text is only one potential interpretation of the text, and to learn from all the other voices involved, our own, the critical literature, and their peers. So to have them annotating just for that isolated reading experience doesn't really get at the core learning objective of assigning reading or critical reading in the classroom. This brings me to the history of reading. And I am a book historian, and I'm also, as mentioned, the pedagogical director of the Book Traces project, which is a project that goes in the circulating stacks of libraries and looks for 19th century texts and sees if there's any original annotations or marginalia notes from 19th century readers. Why? Because we know that annotating texts is actually a historical practice. It dates back to the Talmud, to the early Book of Hours, to really, foundational seminal texts across religions and really across our understanding of literacy. But in the 19th century, books became much cheaper. Paper became much cheaper. And for the first time, communities we would have more than one copy of a text. And because of that, you started having reading groups form. They might be families, religious communities, lovers, friends, that would pass a book back and forth and read it together. Again, the social collaborative reading. The picture you have in front of you is a 19th century text that always makes me laugh because it is obviously two people with a romantic relationship who are arguing about the text. You have on the far left there, someone wrote beautiful. And then in the on the left-hand side in the right margin, you see the thought is beautiful, but, right? And they're disagreeing on their interpretation of the text. And then on the right side, you have one of the annotators talking about, is this a genuine sentiment? Are they really expressing love, the two characters here? And the other one says, no, I think she's a trained flirt. So they're having such an interesting conversation. And we can imagine these two 19th century readers maybe sitting next to each other, in a room, having their flirtatious note passing back and forth. Very similar, again, to the way that we use social media, right? DMing, texting each other back and forth about a text that we might be reading together or about a social experience that we're having. So when my students find examples of this in the stacks, when we do book traces events, they really feel transported to another time where reading was social and reading was public and reading was an experience meant to be shared. And they have no trouble articulating that they see how this is like social media and how they talk with their friends about shared experiences, whether it be, watching the Super Bowl or, political debates or reading, which in fact they are doing across social media spaces. So acknowledging that this has a long history, that collaborative reading has always been part of the reading experience, I'm now trying to figure out how can I capitalize on that very human desire for a collaborative social reading experience using digital tools. Why? Because while we know students have been given the tools to read paper texts, textbooks, novels, physical, tangible objects, oftentimes they lack the tools to read digital texts closely. And all of the neuroscience, all of the cognitive studies that have been done have demonstrated that reading online is a fundamentally different experience. Your brain works in different ways when you read online than when you read on paper. Part of this are things that I'm sure all of you will acknowledge happen to you every time you try to read online, and that's distraction, right? We have pop-ups flying, we have advertisements, we have notifications, we have 100 tabs open. We are multitasking in all sorts of unpredictable ways, and it's very hard to focus on a digital text. But also we are lacking the way that a book is formatted, the table of contents, the turning of pages, the page numbers, and those affordances of a paper, of a bound book, right, are things that we've been trained to use and that we come to rely on when doing academic critical reading. And when we don't have those tools in the digital space, we lose our place, we lose our focus, we have trouble picturing where certain passages were after we've done the reading. And we really do have to support students in making that leap from paper-based reading to online reading. I can tell you with the utmost certainty that the majority of reading being assigned in college classrooms is online. They're online database articles, they're ebooks, they're open educational resources, partly because we're trying to reduce book costs, right? Books are very expensive, college is very expensive. So many universities are leaning on open educational resources and digital resources to reduce those costs. But it's also, practically speaking, the way that students can access materials. And I mean access in terms of they can go online from their dorms, from their homes, from their work, and pull up those texts. But I also mean access in terms of disability. With online texts, our students are using screen readers. They're using keyboard controls. They're using other programs that support all of our learners and meet them where they are, where physical texts don't allow for those kinds of accessibility applications. So we again have a gap that we need to bridge in, not only in teaching students how to grapple with college level content, but also how to navigate born digital content. So I have tried really more social annotation tools than I can count. And I'm not here to promote one specific tool, but rather to show you a method, an approach to using annotation tools for teaching online learning, but not to discredit kind of the experiments I've done with many of these tools. So in all of my trial and error, these are the two tools that I have found to be the easiest to use, the most accessible, and the most successful in the classroom. And that's Hypothesis and Perusal. Hypothesis is great for your for a tool that you're going to bring in to a classroom to do mostly text-based work. So articles, short stories, segments of literary text, primary sources, things of that nature. Perusal does that well, but it also does multimodal text really well. You can annotate video, maps, podcasts. I'm having a lot of fun with the podcast application this term, and infographics, things of that nature. So Perusal does the multimodality really well, and Hypothesis does text really well. Both allow for integration into your learning management system. Both have incredible support teams that are really responsive. Both have excellent privacy and security considerations that are compatible with the K through 12 space. And they both have excellent documentation for K through 12 teachers. And also they meet like the highest accessibility ratings and have extensive documentation on their accessibility features. So I'm going to pause really quickly. I see some chats here. I'm just going to see if there's anything I need to address, any questions or concerns that we have so far. Okay, so I see, Ashley, you're saying that I've used Hypothesis before and it's been 50-50 with feeling comfortable. I absolutely understand. I'm hoping to address some of that learning curve here, and I will, guide you through how I implement it in the classroom and take questions from folks as I go. Is there anything else, Elizabeth, that I should address? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I realize this is cluttered and it's a lot on the screen, but this is just a demonstration of how Hypothesis looks after a class has fully engaged with the text. So this is in one of my first year writing classes. So these are first year students. And in my very meta application of talking about reading on screens with an article about reading on screens, right? I had students annotate this text. You can see on the right-hand side, my students' comments. They come up like little bubbles on the side. And you can see not only do they have, the course section, their username, and their comment, you can also see that they're replying to each other. So they're having rich debates in the margins, talking back and forth amongst themselves. And they're also using multimodal annotations. So you can see there one student has embedded a video into their annotation. You can, in fact, embed videos, hyperlinks, images, and tags, just the way you would on any social media or email platform. And it uses the same kind of buttons. We call them WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get buttons that you're familiar with from your word processing platforms. So a B for bold, an icon of a picture to embed images, an image of a link to embed hyperlinks, and all of those buttons that we're all familiar with from using basic digital composition tools. You'll also notice here that there's a lot of highlights, right? There are a lot of highlights in this screen. Don't let that be intimidating. Students can actually turn them off while they're doing their annotations and then turn them back on when they want to start replying to other folks. It is a very customizable platform, and it really does think about how cluttered it looks and how to break through that noise for students who may need a more focused experience. So how do I set an assignment like this up? Here's an example of how I do this with a literary text. So this is a short story called The Machine Stops, and it is often one of the first short stories that I, like literally week 1, I might assign this in a course because it's short, it's easy to digest, and it allows me to see where students are coming in with their literary analysis skills. In other words, I use it like a diagnostic, right? Can students grapple with the content, and how well-versed are they with analyzing literature and identifying literary devices? So in this assignment, I will ask them to, this is, again, a very short story. I'll ask them to add maybe 5 to 8 annotations and maybe 3 to 5 replies to someone else's annotations. And I give them a very specific set of criteria. I ask them to define words or terms that they may not know, or to define references with links, right, to those references. I ask them to bring in content from their other courses or other content we have covered in our class to connect those texts. I ask them to point out literary devices that they see at work, so foreshadowing, alliteration, etc. And I ask them to ask questions, right? Ask questions for clarification or parts that they don't understand. What you can see in this screenshot is that my students are engaging in a really interesting conversation about this one line where it says, she knew several thousand people. And one student went ahead and did the research and said, research has shown you can only know a couple hundred people. And then another student says, well, but what about social media where we have thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers, and we call them our friends, we call them our connections, we say we know, these thousands of people that we connect with online. And they're having a debate about what does it mean to know people, especially when all of your interactions are happening virtually or in an online space, because that's what this short story happens to be about. So I let the students' interests really drive my in-class lectures. So what I will do is I'll take these kinds of really interesting debates they're having. I pull the screenshot into my slides the day after this assignment is due, and then I offer them further resources for research. I model the research process for them. So I say, if I were someone who is really interested in this idea of social media connections, here are the texts I would read. And here's the kind of the research agenda I would put together to then create a research project around this idea that was inspired by the literature we're reading. Again, making it a student-centered experience, let their interests drive the conversation, but offer my expertise as a follow-up and as a model. So I have linked this for you. This is, you can reuse, remix, beg, borrow, and steal exactly how I set this up in the language I use. I give students a minimum of annotations, a minimum of replies, and I give them a list of the kinds of annotations that they might use, but they are not limited to those kinds of annotations. I always encourage them to do more than the minimum number of annotations and to expand their annotations to the way that they learn best. This assignment would be your really introduction level assignment, the first couple weeks, and then it builds. It will build in terms of the number of annotations I require, but also in the specificity of the kinds of annotations, right? Bringing in literary devices. Sometimes in a composition class, I might have them specifically identify, the thesis, evidence, counter argument, right? Rhetorical analysis work that I want them to understand how an academic article is built and how an argument is being made in those spaces. So you can really customize this depending on the type of assignment you're engaging with your students. Now, there's also, of course, instructors across the disciplines who are using this in really fascinating ways, where they might have students identifying specific themes in a historical text, right? Or they might be using this in a science class where they're having them, connect different experiments on the same topic. There's lots of interesting ways you can do this across the curriculum. One question I always get is how I grade, right? How I grade an assignment like this, or how I assess an assignment like this. So both Hypothesis and Perusal actually have an assessment platform built in, and they do have AI grading built into Perusal. So you can set up your parameters, like what you want each part of the assignment to be worth, and it will suggest a grade for each student, which obviously makes grading very quick. I usually customize that to be very heavy on the comments themselves rather than on the length or how many replies each student gets. And I always talk to students about what it is that I, as their instructor, am looking for in a successful annotation. So that's where I use this probe rubric. Again, I'm not going to get into that deeply here, but I did link it for you. It stands for participation, respectful, open, brave, and educational. So I tell them I am looking for all of your comments to be respectful, open, and I mean open to others' opinions, right? Brave and educational. And I talk about good digital citizenship, how you don't want to be the troll in the YouTube comments here, right? That you want to be really treating this space as a space where you're learning from your peers, where you're speaking to them in a respectful way, where you're considering their opinions and their experience and learning from them, and not shutting down those opinions or cutting off conversation, but being respectful with constructive criticism. And you can see I have that here, right, on number 4, opinions respectfully with evidence. I'm really hoping that teaching students how to comment respectfully will transfer outside of the classroom, right? In all of the social media spaces where we see, vitriol and really negative forms of online communication. So this is how it looks when I bring those comments into my slides. So again, when I teach my unit on the machine stops, I'll kind of preface with some of the historical information that I need to convey to students, and then I'll screenshot their conversation and offer texts for further information. So in the case where students are asking about how many people we can know, I recommended Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, which talks about how even though we seem to be communicating more, we're feeling more lonely. And, loneliness is actually an epidemic in higher education. So I do tend to talk to students about their feelings of loneliness, especially post-quarantine on the East Coast. And we talk about why this text is controversial, why there are some parts that have been criticized, and why there are some parts that can be valuable, and how it could lead to further research on this topic and could build into one of their research assignments. So this would be preceded by several more slides where I would link to other research on the topic, TED Talks on the topic, academic articles on the topic, and model how I would put together like a bibliography of resources if I was interested in this topic. Now I want to show you how great Perusal is to use on non-alphabetic texts. So here you have a course that I am teaching where I want students to watch a TED Talk by Safia Noble. Now this, for me personally, as a professor, I always struggled with, how do I know students are actually watching the whole video, right? Like I can send them a video, but I have no way of knowing if they're actually watching it. And I also know, based on my own experience, that when I am assigned a video to watch, maybe I'm doing 10 other things, right? Maybe I'm folding laundry, maybe I'm making dinner, maybe I'm, right, also scrolling on my phone. All of these other things that are distracting us from focusing on video content in the way that we might an alphabetic text, right? So how do I combat that distraction, that multitasking? I ask students to annotate the videos. So those little, you can see them, these little yellow dots at the bottom are actually the students' annotations. They're marked per second of the video, and they can comment on exactly the moment they find interesting, intriguing, controversial, they have questions about. And I can actually see, right, because of these yellow dots, I can see that they've watched the entire video. I can see that they've engaged with all of the content. And I have not only done this for short TED Talks that are 16 minutes, I actually assign it for full-length feature films because I don't want to spend 2 hours of my precious class time screening a video. I want them to watch the video on their own time and come back and have those rich discussions about the video. Now, of course, it's the college context. I realize you get maybe more time with your students than I do, but I only have an hour and 15 minutes with mine. So I need to capitalize on that time. So here you can see that students are having this really interesting conversation about this idea that we inherit technologies, and this idea, like, will we ever plateau in our technological advancements? And it's really interesting what they're drawing from this and how they're connecting it to the rest of our course content. And again, I will screenshot those, bring them into the class, and give them research resources on the topic. Oh, one important note. I have had many students in many faculty members in modern languages who are using this for oral recitations. So the students will be practicing the language that they're learning, right? So in a French class, they will upload a conversation in French, and then they will use this, the rest of the students' class can annotate and say, oh, you know, your verb conjugation was wrong there, or, oh, you're using the wrong tense here, or, oh, actually, I think you meant this word instead of this word. And it's a great way of practicing for foreign language learning. I've also had, speech professors use it for similar reasons, right? You upload an oral presentation and students can give you feedback. And you can also use it for assessing the same kind of video content. So really interesting uses of this. And again, I'll remind you that you can also do this with podcasts and other forms of multimedia. So to review, this is how the assignment sequence is organized. First, I ask students to annotate the text and respond to their peers in the annotation space. I will sometimes interject when needed. Sometimes I'll give encouragement, like, that's an excellent point. Thank you for connecting it to our other reading. Sometimes I'll add points of clarification, explaining something when students ask a question. But for the most part, I let this be a peer space. Then I use the students' insights as slides. In my classroom, I screenshot relevant conversations, and I provide further research for any debates that are happening, including definitions, quotes from our course reading, etc. One thing that I want to emphasize is that not only do I privilege portions of the text that were heavily annotated by students, therefore I know they were really interested in that topic, but I also pay attention to what they don't annotate. And this is essential. So going back to the machine stops, there's always one passage in the machine stops that no one annotates. And I've taught the text dozens of times. There's always one paragraph that is blank. I was wondering why students left that blank when they so deeply and heavily annotated the rest of the text. So when I brought it up in class, I found out that students didn't understand that passage. Why? It was a passage where the author was writing about eras in human history, but they were made up, right? So it was a joke about misinformation And it was a satire on the future of information and how we would just kind of forget history and make up our own past. And the students didn't get the joke, right? Like they didn't understand that it was satire. So they were looking up these historical eras and not finding the results on Google and thinking that they were just not educated enough to understand the reference. So by them not annotating that section, it was really the only way I could have known that they didn't get the joke. It was incredibly informative to me. I never would have known that that part of the text was problematic for them had I not assigned it with the annotation software. So yes, I do bring in the student insights and center those, but I also pay attention to what wasn't annotated and make sure I explain that in my very precious class time. So after the annotation assignment is finished, I then derive very low stakes writing prompts about these topics. So I'll put students into groups, have them each write a provocation and have the rest of the students answer those provocations in rotating groups so that they're only in charge of the discussion for 1 week and then they become respondents in the following weeks. Those students who are leading the provocation in the writing prompts, the online discussion board posts, then lead the discussion in class as well in fishbowls. So the students who are in charge of that week's reading will sit in the middle. The rest of us will sit on the outside. They have 15 minutes to talk amongst themselves with no interruption, including from me. And then after, I will summarize the interesting points I heard and the rest of the class will respond. It's putting them again in charge of their own learning, them driving the conversation, and gradually scaffolding their learning from the very low stakes annotation to a little bit more involved writing prompts where they will have to bring in a quote, cite it in MLA style, and then lead an actual in-class discussion where they're verbally explaining the text and their interest in it. And then last but not least, that leads to the high stakes essay where they're bringing in those quotes and that research that they've gathered across text together in a research paper. I'm going to pause again. I do see some activity in the chat. Let's see, is there anything? Can you see individual students on the videos? Yes, you see individual students. You can filter annotations by specific students. You can look at, conversations, and when you're grading them, you can see all of the students' annotations in one place. So you can see exactly how many that they've done and what they were commenting on. It's a very well designed platform and interface for doing that. Are there any other questions that I'm not seeing, Elizabeth?
I think you're all good. Yep.
Great. Again, please feel free at any time to raise your hand or put questions in the chat. I know I'm going pretty fast. All right. So I've also used these tools for individual students to work on their research papers. So here's a student in one of my upper level courses where they'd already chosen a research topic and they had already chosen about 5 to 10 sources that they wanted to read before writing, right? To do that research before they started writing their final paper. So what I have them do is I have them do rhetorical analysis work on those articles, bringing all of their different resources together, putting them in conversation together using the social annotation platform. So you can see my student here has put quotes from her other research texts in the margins of this text to show how they connect, which really, I mean, as a writing instructor, this is the goal, right? The goal is for students to understand how texts are talking to each other and how they're on the same topic, how they're contradicting each other, how they're supporting each other, and how, texts are not written in isolation of each other, but that in academia, we're hoping to bring all of those voices together in our research and respond accordingly. So I'm using the social annotation software for them to do that pre-writing, that preliminary work before they move to putting together these building blocks of research into their own writing. It's been incredibly effective, and I've had many students say that they now use these tools on their own for research papers outside of my classroom because it has really helped them put their research together. I do know students who have used this for graduate level thesis and dissertation work, especially because you can tag. So for example, if a student is looking at 3 different themes across literature or across research, they can tag their annotations with those themes, and then they can export those annotations to a lot of different platforms. For example, Microsoft Word or Google Docs, to a spreadsheet, right? However, their research process works best. So how does this connect to your TEKS? Well, I actually think I probably don't even need to tell you this, but it's definitely helping them develop and sustain foundational readings, language skills, right? They're listening, they're speaking, they're reading, they're writing, and it's definitely about the self-sustained reading and using those tools to support self-sustained reading. It's also supporting comprehension skills, right? They're thinking across multiple texts. They're trying to deepen their comprehension of very complex texts that you might have to read and reread and engage with multiple times before you fully understand the text. And it's obviously about response skills, right? I'm requiring them to respond to each other. I'm requiring them to respond to the text. I'm requiring them to read each other's responses, to understand how to both be heard and to hear others in conversation about those texts, both in the asynchronous space and in the face-to-face classroom. And I'm very much focusing on the author's purpose and craft, right? What is the purpose of the text they're reading? What are the main arguments? What are the references they're making? Trying to analyze those authors' choices, and how, the author is building their argument across a text. So hopefully that's really helping the students like analyze and apply the author's craft to then, right, create their own products. Any questions about how this applies to our TEKS? Am I saying it right, TEKS? I hope I am. All right. So why does this work? Why is this effective? In the world of educational technology, there's an age-old debate. Does the technology drive the pedagogy, or does the pedagogy drive the technology? So let me explain. A lot of times we're given tools. Hey, here's a bunch of iPads. Here's a smartboard for your classroom. And then you have to figure out, how am I going to connect this shiny new toy to my pedagogy, right? I'm given this tool. I've got to figure out how to make it match my learning outcomes, right? And, sometimes we need to do that. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it ends up having the technology influence your pedagogy in ways that, don't really work or don't really make sense for that particular assignment or unit. On the flip side, sometimes we have an assignment and we're like, this assignment, I've been doing it for years. It's working okay, but it could really use some, invigoration. It could, I'm kind of tired of teaching it. Maybe I need to make it more exciting. So you add a technology tool thinking that it will kind of solve the problem, that it will make it feel new and interesting. But again, maybe the tool doesn't really match the assignment very well. Maybe it's actually the assignment that needed to be redesigned, not just kind of adding a tool on top. And these two things happen all the time in classrooms. It doesn't mean we're a bad teacher, and it doesn't mean we're doing things wrong, but sometimes, right, the outcomes, right, the outcomes aren't as genuine or authentic to supporting our students' skill development as we want. So this approach is an approach we call entangled pedagogy, where the technology and the pedagogical objectives are really being built together. They're really being, they're for the same purposes, they're for the same values, and you're taking the tool and designing the assignment along with it. And you're also learning, right, from your students about how best these tools work. So the teachers and students are collaborating together. They're in the same space. They're designing and practicing the work at the same time. And you as the instructor are learning from your students as well as your students learning from each other. So it's a very collaborative process. It does take some embracing of uncertainty and imperfection. You don't know what your students are going to say, right? In those spaces, you don't know how they might use this tool in ways that you can't predict. But that's part of that probe rubric I talked about, where we're really trying to be open and honest, meet students where they are, and learn from them where they're struggling and where their interest and passion lies within the materials that we're providing. The idea is for collaborative, community-driven knowledge building. So the knowledge is being built across the entire classroom, not just from the professor or instructor coming down to the students, but learning together. And I have to tell you that I have learned so much from my students' annotations. I have really expanded my approach to some of these texts, my understanding of some of these texts, because my students have brought in such rich resources in the comments and such interesting questions into the annotations that I could never have predicted otherwise. So I really do learn from them every day using this method. Do the tools break? Absolutely, right? It's Murphy's Law with technology. Sometimes they don't work in the way you anticipate. Sometimes they're not the right tool for every text, right? I don't use this for every single text I assign in a class. I don't find it effective for a full novel, for example, right? Or for really lengthy works. I've experimented with some texts that don't work well with this and others that work incredibly well with it. So it's definitely a learning process, as any new tool in the classroom will be. You don't have to take my word for it, though. These are real comments from my students who wrote these in anonymous student evaluations where I did not ask about annotation. In other words, they voluntarily, without being prompted, were raving about how much they loved these tools in their anonymous student evaluations. You have students here talking about how it helped them in other classes to read their work, that they actually used the tools I was introducing to them for their work in other classes. You have them talking about how it was really fun and interactive. And for me, part of any class I teach is for it to be fun, because I want students to fall in love with reading again, to fall in love with writing again, and to take that joy right throughout their life. They talk about how it was really a great way of keeping focus, which we know that students are struggling with. We know that they struggle with focus, especially in the online space. You have them talking about how it helped them support their claims and find evidence that they found it really challenging, but in a good way. So for me, this is the real evidence that matters, is that the students are finding this a really enriching experience, and that they're carrying these digital literacy skills into other aspects of their life. All right, now it's time for us to play. It's time for you to try out these tools. So I have a link here, which is also going to be put in the chat for you. So I created a private group for Texas Humanities to test out Hypothesis. And I put a sample article in there. I'm going to ask that you, click on the link, join the group, and then you're going to see, just like the screenshot shows, you're going to see the name of the article, and you're going to see this button that says Visit Annotations in Context. When you click on that, it opens in a different tab. If you have an Android device or a PC device, it might sign you out. This is a security measure built into those devices. So on this little person icon right here, please make sure that you're actually signed in when it opens up in the new tab, that it didn't sign you out. And make sure that you have the Texas Humanities 2023 group at the top and that you're not annotating in public. There are many public annotations on this text, but we're using this private group as a sandbox space to learn. And then I just want everyone to try to click some portion of the text and annotate, just write one comment just to make sure that everyone knows how to use it. Hi, everyone. I think I was able to get to all the breakout rooms. You had great questions. I know we're almost out of time, but I did want to stress one thing in conclusion, and that this is a wonderful tool to combat AI. And what I mean by that is that I have a lot of requests from faculty that have been assigning write a summary of this article or write a few paragraph description of what you've read or something like that. And of course, those are now being generated by AI tools. And they're having a hard time deciding, did their students actually do the reading, or are they just putting the prompt into one of these generators and spitting out these summaries? Because honestly, AI does summaries really, really well, right? They excel at doing that kind of, in Bloom's taxonomy, those kind of low level learning ability. They do great basic analysis. They do great summaries. This is an amazing tool to see how your students are doing the reading, to see how they're understanding the reading, that they can't use AI to get around. I think there are many wonderful applications for AI. I'm not saying that we should shun it or ban it or any of those things. But what I'm saying is when you're trying to figure out, did my students do the reading? This is a way of doing that kind of that gets around the possibility of them trying to use one of those tools to do the work. I have seen it time and time again across all the disciplines, this being a really great way of literally watching your students read, right? You're able to watch your students engage with the reading or engage with the multimodal content in a way that could feel a little bit like surveillance, but because you're seeing them line by line engage with the content, but is also a way to make sure they're understanding, to see where they're struggling, and again, to meet them where they are. So if you are worried about AI and you're worried about how those kinds of assignments are now seeming to be impossible, this is really a great way of addressing that. Great. These are great comments in the chat. Thank you so much for them. In my very last slide, I do point to a book chapter I've written on this topic that's in a collection full of really great academic articles on digital reading and how to prepare students for reading in online spaces. And I also offer my email address where you can reach out to me anytime. I'm always happy to hear from you. And if you need help or resources on how to advocate to get this in use at your institution, please do let me know. Thank you all so much.